She was 22, and for all intents and purposes, homeless. She had no family to speak of, no clear plan, and just $20 to her name, along with a small, dense hammer wrapped in oilcloth. With one of those dollars, she bought a wrecked buckboard that everyone in Providence Gulch considered firewood. But what nobody knew, what the laughing men and the pitying women could not see, was that welded beneath the broken seat was a secret that would not only change her life, but resurrect the very town that had dismissed her. Della Frost was a child of the high mountain air, born in a mining camp where the only lullaby was the distant rhythmic thunder of a stamp mill. Her father, Marcus Frost, was a man who chased ambition down from the peaks and into the city, taking his family to a tidy house in Denver where the air was thick with the scent of money and social climbing. Her mother, Eleanor, embraced this new world, trading her sturdy mountain boots for delicate slippers and her practicality for the fragile currency of reputation. But Della never quite left the mountains behind. They lived inside her, a quiet landscape of stone and pine that the city could not pave over. Her true home had never been a house, but a place of fire and iron, the smithy of her maternal grandfather, Elias Thorne. Elias was a man forged from the same elements as his trade, solid, quiet, and possessed of a heat that could shape the most stubborn material into something of use and beauty. He saw the same substance in his granddaughter. While her parents despaired of her skinned knees and the smudge of grease on her cheek, Elias saw a steady hand and a patient eye. In the singing heat of his forge, he taught her the language of metal, not just the brute force of the sledge, but the careful art of listening to the steel. He taught her how to read the cherry-red glow that signaled the perfect moment for shaping, how to interpret the subtle ring of a hammer strike, and how to spot a hairline fracture that could spell disaster. He gave her a small hammer he had forged himself, the head a perfect polished weight of tempered steel, the handle of fire-hardened hickory shaped precisely to her grip. It was not a toy, but a tool, and in his giving it, he acknowledged her as a fellow craftswoman. "Look at the work, not the worker," he would say, his voice a low rumble beneath the hiss of the quenching tub. "Good work speaks for itself. It lasts." He taught her that everything, a hinge, a wheel, a life, was a matter of stresses and supports, and that understanding how things were built was the only way to understand why they broke. When Elias died, the fire in the forge went out, and with it, the only real warmth in Della's life. Her parents sold the smithy, its anvils and tongs scattered to strangers, and the last echo of her grandfather's hammer faded into the silence of a Denver parlor. Life in Denver was a lesson in suffocation. Della was enrolled in a ladies' academy where she was taught posture, piano, and the art of saying nothing of substance. Her hands, accustomed to the reassuring heft of wood and iron, fumbled with delicate teacups and embroidery needles. Her mind, trained to solve practical problems of leverage and balance, rebelled against the abstract rules of social etiquette. Her father, now a banker, regarded her with a growing sense of despair. Her quiet competence, her direct gaze, her lack of feminine artifice, they were a constant, mortifying reminder of the mountain origins he was so desperate to erase. He saw her as a piece of unrefined ore in a world that valued only the polished and gilded. For Della, the city was a place of profound uselessness. She watched as men in fine suits made fortunes from paper promises, while the tangible, honest world of making and mending seemed a distant dream. She felt like a tool left to rust in a velvet-lined box, her purpose forgotten, her edges growing dull. She carried her grandfather's hammer with her, wrapped in a linen cloth at the bottom of her trunk, a secret anchor to a world where she had made sense. The paper promises her father dealt in were as brittle as glass. His ambition had always outpaced his caution, and in the panic of a market downturn, his speculations shattered. The collapse was not a sudden, dramatic explosion, but a slow, silent crumbling. First the whispers, then the closed doors, then the polite but firm refusal of credit. The Frost family's gilded cage dissolved around them. The house on the tidy street was sold, its contents auctioned off to strangers who handled their possessions with cold, appraising eyes. They moved to a series of progressively smaller, shabbier rented rooms, each one a step down into a quiet, well-mannered hell. Marcus Frost, who had once commanded boardrooms, now struggled to meet the gaze of his landlord. Eleanor, who had presided over elegant teas, now grew gaunt and silent. Her world shrunk to the four walls of their latest failure. Through it all, Della was a quiet, observant presence. She did not weep or rage. She saw the mechanics of the collapse with the clear, dispassionate eye her grandfather had taught her. She saw the flawed design, the unsustainable stress, the inevitable fracture. Her parents' life had been built on a poor foundation, and now it was paying the price. But her practicality was no comfort to them. It was an indictment. She was the living proof of a world they had abandoned, a world of substance and resilience they now desperately needed and could no longer access. In the end, they could not bear the sight of her. The ejection, when it came, was not a heated argument or a tearful farewell. It was a simple, brutal transaction conducted in the gray morning light of a cramped boarding house room that smelled of dust and despair. Her father, looking older and smaller than she had ever seen him, sat at a Ricca Simply table. He did not look at her as he pushed a folded piece of paper and a few worn bills across the scarred wood. "There is a train for the Western Slope at noon," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "This will take you as far as Providence Gulch." He named a town from his past, a place he had not seen in 2 decades. "I have written to a distant cousin. They will see to you." It was a lie, and they both knew it. There was no cousin. There was only the raw, undeniable fact that her presence was a weight he could no longer carry. He was casting her off, not into a new life, but simply away from his own. He was a broken man, and he could not stand to be witnessed by the one person in his family who was not. Della looked at the ticket, then at the $20. It was a pittance, the last dregs of a vanished fortune, but it was also a severance. She did not plead or question. To do so would have been to participate in the fiction that this was anything other than an abandonment. She saw the hollows under her father's eyes, the tremor in his hand as he lit a cheap cigarillo. She saw her mother standing by the window, her back to the room, a statue of denial. In that moment, Della felt a cold, clean pang of something like pity, but it was distant, like watching a structure collapse from a safe hill. They were strangers to her, and she to them. She simply nodded. "All right," she said. The word was not one of agreement, but of acknowledgement. A fact had been stated, and she was accepting it. She went to her small trunk, the only piece of furniture that was truly hers, and packed a canvas satchel. A change of clothes, a bar of soap, a brush, and, from the very bottom, the oilcloth-wrapped weight of her grandfather's hammer. She secured it in the center of the bag, its familiar density a small, solid point in a world that had become fluid and uncertain. When she was ready, she walked to the door. Her father still did not look up. Her mother did not turn. Della did not say goodbye. She simply opened the door, stepped into the hallway, and closed it quietly behind her. The soft click of the latch, the final, understated sound of her old life ending. The journey was a rumbling, clattering passage from one world to another. The train pulled out of Denver, leaving the grid of manicured streets and desperate ambitions behind, and began its long, slow climb into the mountains. Della sat on a hard wooden bench, her satchel on her lap, and watched the landscape transform. The flat, brown plains gave way to rolling foothills dotted with scrub oak, which in turn surrendered to the deep green of pine and fir as the train chugged its way up the winding grade. The air grew thinner, cleaner, smelling of pine needles and cold stone. It was a smell that unlocked a part of her she had thought long buried, the scent of her grandfather's mountain and the clear, uncomplicated purpose of his forge. The other passengers in the car were a mix of prospectors with wild eyes, merchants with weary ones, and families heading towards some new, uncertain hope. No one spoke to her, and she was grateful for the silence. It allowed her to observe, to feel the rhythm of the steel wheels on the track, the sway of the car, the slow, inexorable pull of gravity as they ascended. She arrived in Providence Gulch as the sun was dipping behind the jagged peaks, casting long purple shadows across the valley. The town was little more than a single wide street carved out of the mountainside, a collection of unpainted, false-fronted buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the vast, indifferent wilderness. A cold wind swept down from the pass, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the faint, metallic tang of an old mine. There was no cousin waiting for her, of course. There was only the raw, unvarnished reality of a town clinging to the edge of existence. With a calm that felt less like courage and more like simple necessity, Della shouldered her satchel and walked the length of the street. Her eyes, trained to assess structure and wear, took in every detail. The sagging porch of the general store, the fresh paint on the saloon, the shuttered windows of the assayer's office. She found a boarding house run by a woman with a face as weathered as the surrounding mountains, a Mrs. Gable. The room she was given was small and spare, containing only a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out onto a back alley. It was clean. It cost $5 for the week, paid in advance. Della handed over one of the crisp bills, her fortune now reduced to $15 and a handful of change. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sigh of the wind in the pines, the full weight of her solitude finally settled upon her. She was alone, with dwindling funds and no prospects. Yet, as she drifted to sleep, one hand resting on the satchel that held her grandfather's hammer, she did not feel fear. She felt a strange, quiet readiness. The world had stripped her down to her foundation, and she was about to find out how strong it was. The first days in Providence Gulch were a quiet education in rejection. Della rose each morning, washed her face in cold water from the basin, and went in search of work. She was methodical. She asked for washing and mending at the boarding house, but Mrs. Gable did her own. She inquired about clerking at the mercantile, but the owner, a pinched man named Abernathy, shook his head, his eyes lingering on her calloused hands. "Not looking for help," he said, though she had seen his son struggling to unload a wagon just that morning. She offered to sweep out the saloon, to muck stalls at the livery, to cook for the miners. The answers were always the same: a polite but firm no, an amused shake of the head. A door closed gently in her face. They saw a young woman, alone and adrift, and their assumptions were a wall she could not seem to breach. She was an object of pity or suspicion, a problem they did not want to take on. Her practicality was invisible to them. They saw only her vulnerability. With each refusal, her money dwindled. $10, $9, $8. She began to walk, not to search for work anymore, but simply to move, to fight off the cold paralysis of despair. Her walks took her to the edges of the town, past the last houses and up the paths that led into the hills. On the west end of town, past the livery stable run by a burly Irishman named Finn O'Malley, was a sprawling junk pile, a graveyard for the town's broken things. Wrecked wagons, rusted tools, shattered crockery, and splintered furniture lay in a chaotic heap. To the townspeople, it was an eyesore. To Della, it was an encyclopedia of failure. She could trace the story of each object: the cracked axle from a wagon that took a corner too fast, the snapped handle of a shovel that met a rock it could not move. One afternoon, half hidden behind a pile of rotting timbers, she saw it. It was the wreck of a buckboard, and it was in a terrible state. One of the rear wheels was a starburst of splintered spokes. The axle beneath it bent into a sad, useless curve. The seat was torn, its horsehair stuffing spilling out like entrails, and the wooden bed was cracked in several places. It had clearly been in a serious accident, likely on the treacherous pass above the town, and had been dragged here to be forgotten. Others saw firewood and scrap. Della saw something else. She walked around it, her eyes tracing the lines of its construction. The frame was solid oak, weathered but not rotten. The iron fittings, though rusted, were heavy and well forged. She ran her hand over the bent axle, the cold iron familiar under her palm. She could feel the memory of her grandfather's forge in its very grain. He had taught her that a bend was not a break. He had taught her that good material, even when damaged, held its integrity. She knelt and looked closer, her gaze sharp and analytical. The joinery was sound, the basic structure intact. In her mind, she began to dismantle and rebuild it, seeing not a wreck, but a collection of salvageable parts, a puzzle waiting to be solved. A plan, small and fragile, began to form. She walked to the livery, where Finn O'Malley was shoeing a horse. The town boys who loitered there snickered as she approached. "What do you want for the buckboard?" she asked, her voice even. O'Malley paused, hammer in hand, and looked at her as if she'd lost her mind. "That piece of junk?" he laughed. "It's yours for the hauling." "I'll give you $1 for it," Della said. The price was not for the wood or the iron, it was for the dignity of a clean transaction. The laughter from the boys grew louder. "She's going to pay for firewood," one of them crowed. O'Malley studied her for a long moment, a flicker of something, pity, curiosity, perhaps respect, in his eyes. He wiped his hand on his leather apron and extended it. $1 it is, lass," he said, his voice suddenly serious. She placed one of her last precious coins in his palm. The deal was done. The town had a new fool, and Della Frost had a purpose. The work was slow and arduous. Della had no mule, no wagon, only her own strength and the simple principles of leverage her grandfather had taught her. She spent the next 2 days dragging the pieces of the buckboard from the town's junk pile to a small, sheltered clearing behind the livery stable, a spot O'Malley had grudgingly allowed her to use. She moved the larger frame by using a long plank as a lever, inching it forward a few feet at a time. The wheels, even the broken one, she rolled. The smaller pieces she carried. The town watched with amusement. The men on the porch of the mercantile made jokes. The women whispered behind their hands. They saw a desperate girl engaged in a pointless, back-breaking folly. They did not see the quiet, methodical focus in her eyes. They did not see the work. Once all the pieces were gathered, she began the real task: dismantling. This was not destruction, but a careful deconstruction, an autopsy to understand the nature of the wreck and the potential for rebirth. With a few borrowed tools, a wrench from O'Malley, a pry bar she'd found in the junk pile, she started to take the buckboard apart. Every bolt was rusted, every nut frozen in place. She used what little she had, tapping with her hammer to break the rust's seal, using her whole body to turn a stubborn bolt. She saved everything, every nut, every bolt, every bracket and brace, laying them out in neat rows on a piece of canvas. She was a surgeon, and this was her operating theater. As she worked, she learned the buckboard's history. The deep gouges in the frame spoke of a violent crash, a sudden stop against rock. The bent axle told a story of immense force. Finally, she came to the driver's seat. It was unusually heavy, far heavier than a simple plank and cushion should be. The leather was rotted and torn, the horsehair stuffing damp and matted. As she worked to unbolt it from the frame, she noticed something strange. The underside was not just a single wooden plank. A thick sheet of iron, about a foot square, had been bolted over the center. The bolt heads were common, but their ends had been peened over, flattened with a hammer to make them difficult to remove. A crude repair, she thought at first. But then she looked closer. Her eyes, trained in the forge, saw what no one else would have. Running along the edge of the iron plate, almost hidden by rust and grime, was a thick, clumsy, unmistakable bead of a weld. It wasn't a neat smith's weld. It was a desperate farmer's weld, made with more heat than skill. This was not a patch. It was a seal. A secret. A thrill, cold and sharp, went through her. She set aside the wrench and picked up her own hammer, its weight a familiar comfort in her hand. Using the sharpened end of the pry bar as a makeshift cold chisel, she placed the tip against the rough edge of the weld and struck it firmly. The sound, a sharp tink, was absorbed by the heavy iron. Again and again she struck, moving the chisel along the seam, her blows steady and precise. It was her grandfather's work, in reverse, not joining but parting. The sun moved across the sky. Her arm began to ache, but she did not stop. After what felt like hours, a section of the weld gave way with a grating crack. She worked the pry bar into the opening and leaned on it with all her weight. The metal groaned in protest, and then, with a final, shuddering pop, the plate broke free. It fell to the ground with a heavy thud. Nestled in a shallow, hand-carved hollow in the wood beneath was a small, heavy iron box, its surface pitted with rust. Beside it, wrapped carefully in a sheet of oilcloth, was a packet of papers. Her heart pounding, she reached for the papers first. She unwrapped the oilcloth with trembling fingers. Inside were a dozen folded sheets, assay reports. Each one detailed a sample taken from the North Star mine, the big claim on the mountain above town that everyone said had been played out for a year. The reports, signed by a man named Silas Kane, showed staggering concentrations of gold and silver ore. They were dated just over a year ago. Tucked into the last report was a small, hastily scrawled note. The handwriting was shaky. "They ran me off, said the vein was pinched. Liars. The North Star is richer than ever. This is for whoever finds it. My name was Silas Kane. I was an honest man." She then turned to the box. The lock was simple, and she broke it with a single sharp blow from the pry bar. Inside, there was no glint of coins. Instead, the box was filled to the brim with small, heavy leather pouches. She opened one. It was full of a coarse, glittering yellow powder. Gold dust. Silas Kane's last hidden payment. In her hands, she held it all. The map, the proof, and the capital to bring a dead mine and a forgotten man's legacy back to life. The discovery settled a profound calm over Della. The gold dust was not a treasure to be spent. It was capital to be invested. The assay reports were not a windfall. They were a blueprint for work. The ghost of Silas Kane had not left her a fortune, but a responsibility. Her first move was one of careful verification. She took one of the smaller, less detailed reports and a tiny, almost imperceptible pinch of the gold dust, wrapping it in a twist of paper. She walked not to the main assayer's office, which was shuttered, but to a small shack on the edge of town where an old man named Jedediah Stone lived. He was a retired prospector who had forgotten more about ore than most men ever knew. She found him sitting on his porch, carving a piece of wood. Without a word, she handed him the paper and the twist of dust. He squinted at the dust in his palm, then touched a bit to his tongue. He unfolded the report, his eyes scanning the columns of figures. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of the wind. Finally, he looked up, his gaze sharp and penetrating, not at the paper, but at her. "Silas Kane," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. He was a good man, a geologist, not just a pick-and-shovel man. Knew his rock. The company men from Denver said his claim was a bust. Ran him out of town on a rail of lies. He looked from Della's face to the high peaks looming over the town. He always said the North Star had another pocket. Looks like he found it. He handed the report back to her. This dust is high grade, and this paper is proof. That was all the confirmation she needed. Her next stop was the county records office, a dusty room in the back of the mercantile. The clerk, the same man who had refused her work, looked at her with bored indifference. She asked to see the claim map for the North Star mine. He grunted and pulled out a large, rolled canvas. The claim was marked abandoned. Following the procedure Silas Kane's note had indirectly laid out, Della paid the $5 filing fee from her precious gold dust, weighed out on Mr. Abernathy's own scales. She filed a new claim on the North Star, in the name of Della Frost. The clerk stamped the papers with a profound lack of interest. The North Star was hers. That afternoon, she turned her capital into tools. At Abernathy's mercantile, she did not haggle. She chose with a clear, practical eye 2 new pickaxes with hickory handles, 3 round-point shovels, a coil of good hemp rope, 2 lanterns, a 5-gallon can of oil, and a dozen candles. She paid for it all with the glittering dust, weighing it out herself on the counter scale, her hand steady. Mr. Abernathy watched, his pinched face a mask of confusion and dawning avarice. The final piece of her plan was labor. She knew she couldn't work the mine alone. That evening, she went to the saloon. In a corner, drinking cheap whiskey and nursing their misfortune, were 2 brothers, Tom and Ben Carter. They were good miners who had been laid off when the last working vein in the area had petered out. They were planning to leave town the next day. She walked straight to their table. "I have a claim on the North Star," she said, her voice clear and low, not carrying to the rest of the room. "And I have assay reports that say it's still rich. I need men who aren't afraid of hard work. I can't promise you a share, not yet, but I can pay you a fair daily wage in gold." They looked at her, then at each other, skepticism warring with desperation in their eyes. Tom, the older brother, finally spoke. "Show us the dust." Della opened her hand and showed them a small nugget she had taken from one of the pouches. It was enough. "We start at sunrise," she said. The rebuilding had begun. Word spread through Providence Gulch like a grass fire. The girl who had hauled a broken buckboard through the street was now marching up the mountain every morning with the Carter brothers in tow. At first, the town was merely curious. Then, the source of the rumor reached the company men in Denver who had bought out Silas Kane's partners and declared the North Star worthless. They had acquired the claim for pennies on the dollar, a strategic move to consolidate their holdings, never believing it held any real value. The news that a lone woman was now working their barren rock was an irritation, then an alarm. They sent an agent, a slick man in a city suit named Harris, to handle the situation. Harris arrived on the afternoon stage, expecting to intimidate a foolish girl. He found Della at the mine entrance, her face smudged with dirt, her hands wrapped around a shovel handle. He blustered about legal ownership and prior claims. It was then that the first threads of community began to weave themselves around Della. Jedediah Stone appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, walking up the trail with his prospecting hammer in hand. "The claim was legally abandoned, Harris," Jedediah said, his voice carrying the weight of undisputed local authority. "And Miss Frost's filing is rock solid. I saw it myself, just like I saw the assay reports you and your company buried." Harris, faced with the town's most respected elder, found his threats turning to smoke. He retreated down the mountain, vowing legal action that never came. The encounter solidified Della's position. She was no longer an outsider, she was a contender. The work in the mine was brutal, but rewarding. Following the meticulous notes left by Silas Kane, Della and the Carter brothers bypassed the collapsed and barren shafts. They cleared a secondary entrance Kane had started, and within a week, they hit the vein he had described. It was a ribbon of quartz, shot through with the unmistakable gleam of gold and the dark, heavy luster of silver ore. It was richer than any of them had ever seen. The first load of ore they brought down the mountain was a spectacle. They used a borrowed sledge, and the whole town seemed to turn out to watch them haul it to the stamp mill. The mill, silent for almost a year, was fired up at Della's expense. The rhythmic, earth-shaking thump, thump, thump of the stamps crushing her ore was the sound of a heartbeat returning to Providence Gulch. That sound was a proclamation of success. Finn O'Malley, who had sold her the buckboard, approached her not with a laugh, but with an offer. "You'll be needing a proper mule team to haul that ore, Miss Frost. I'll give you a fair rate." Mrs. Gable, her landlady, began packing a substantial lunch for her every morning, refusing any payment. "A working woman needs her strength," she'd say simply. People on the street no longer looked at her with pity. They greeted her by name. "Morning, Miss Frost." With the profits from the first smelting, she paid Tom and Ben a handsome bonus and put them on as full-time foremen. She invested in new timbers to make the North Star safe, bought a team of strong mules from O'Malley, and commissioned the town's carpenter to build 2 new, sturdy ore wagons. And in the evenings, after long days at the mine, she worked on her first project. Piece by piece, she began to restore the wrecked buckboard. She straightened the frame, replaced the splintered boards, and commissioned the blacksmith to forge a new axle and repair the broken wheel. She bought new leather and taught herself to stitch a new seat cover. When it was finished, it was not a fancy carriage, but a strong, plain, functional vehicle. She painted it a simple, dark green, and on the side, in clean white letters, she painted a name, the Silas. It was not a monument to her success, but a quiet, constant reminder of its foundation. A year passed, then another. The North Star Mine became the lifeblood of Providence Gulch. Its steady production brought new prosperity to the town. The mercantile expanded, the saloon hired a piano player, and new families began to arrive, drawn by the promise of steady work. Della Frost was no longer just a mine owner. She was the quiet center of the town's revival. She built a small, solid cabin for herself on a plot of land overlooking the town, not far from the livery. It was simple and well-made, with a stone fireplace and shelves for the few books she had acquired. From her porch, she could see the lights of the town she had, in her own way, helped to rebuild. One cool evening in late autumn, she stood at the entrance to the North Star. The day's work was done, and the Carter brothers were leading the last mule team down the mountain. The air was crisp with the promise of snow, and the setting sun painted the peaks in hues of orange and deep violet. In her right hand, she held the small hammer her grandfather had made for her. Its weight was a familiar comfort, a solid connection to the man who had taught her to see the truth in things, to value substance over surface. She ran her thumb over the smooth, fire-hardened hickory of the handle, a silent communion with his memory. He had taught her to look at the work, and the work was all around her, in the safely timbered mine shaft, in the prosperous town glowing below, in the very ground beneath her feet. Her thoughts turned to Silas Kane, the honest geologist she had never met, but to whom she owed everything. His legacy was not just the gold and silver pulled from the earth, but the quiet act of defiance he had welded into a broken-down buckboard. Down at her cabin, the Silas was parked, its green paint catching the last of the light. It was her preferred vehicle for trips to town, a constant mobile reminder that what one person discards, another can rebuild into a foundation. She thought, for a fleeting moment, of her parents. She had received a letter, forwarded from Denver, from a distant acquaintance. It spoke of her father's passing and her mother's reduced circumstances. With her first significant profits, Della had sent a bank draft to a lawyer in Denver with instructions to settle her father's most pressing debts and provide a small, anonymous stipend for her mother. It was not an act of forgiveness or even of love, but of a different kind of duty. It was the balancing of a ledger, a structural repair to the family name, a practical solution. She had closed a door, quietly and firmly, just as one had been closed on her. Her gaze drifted from the high, lonely peaks to the warm, clustered lights of Providence Gulch. She was not just a resident here. She was part of its fabric, woven into its story as surely as the gold was woven into the quartz. She was Miss Frost, who had arrived with nothing but $20 and a strange attachment to a broken wagon. Della Frost, who had bought a pile of firewood for $1. She smiled, a small, private expression. It was, without question, the best dollar she had ever spent. It had not bought a mine, not really. It had bought her a home.